Welcome everyone to today's live talk brought to you by Bayer. My name is Ariane de Hoog and I'm going to be the moderator. And this event is fitting as yesterday was World Science Day. This year's leading topic was science for and with society, which is closely linked to another important topic, namely trust in science. We want to take this opportunity to talk about both topics. And to this end, we have invited Professor Naomi Oreskes and Matthias Berninger. Last year, Naomi published her book, Why Trust Science, and is therefore an ideal expert to talk to on this subject matter. And her book begins with the following paragraph, and I'd like to quote for you. Science confronts a public crisis of trust. From the Oval Office in Washington and on news media around the world, the scientific consensus is challenged and misrepresented. Doubts about science are sown by tobacco companies, the fossil fuel industry, free market think tanks, and other powerful organizations with financial interests. End quote. So in the next hour, we will talk, among other things, about causes for this distrust in science and what role research-based companies can play in defending and rebuilding that trust in science. So first and foremost, let me introduce you to Naomi. She has been professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of earth and planetary science at Harvard University since 2013. She is an internationally renowned geologist, science historian, and author, and moreover, Naomi is a leading voice on the role of science in society and the issue of anthropogenic climate change. She is author and co-author of 7 books and over 150 articles, essays, and opinion pieces. And today she is joining us from the Boston area. Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And now to Matthias. So since 2019, Matthias has been Senior Vice President for Public Affairs, Science and Sustainability for Bayer. He is the architect of the company's significantly enhanced global sustainability platform launched last year with strong leadership commitment. The aim is for the strategy to signal a corporate ambition, namely helping more people thrive within the planetary boundaries. And this includes bold commitments and steps towards more sustainability and transparency. And today he's joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Matthias.
Hi, Ariane.
So for the sake of transparency, I should also mention that Bayer supported the Harvard Data Science Initiative Trust in Science with a $1 million donation this year. And before we start, a quick note, I cordially invite you all to participate in this discussion. We want to hear from you, so please do use the comment function on your screen for this purpose. I will see those comments and I will incorporate your questions accordingly. So let's begin, and I first want to talk about your personal link to science. So Naomi, you're a professor at Harvard University, and your personal link to science is more than obvious, but what sparked your enthusiasm for science, and when did you know you wanted to take this path and become a scientist?
Well, that's a complicated question, but and also I should say that although Bayer is supporting the Harvard Data Science Initiative, I personally have no connection with that initiative, and I personally receive no money from Bayer. I do think that's important for me to say. So I've been interested in science all my life. My father was a scientist. He was an immunologist and biochemist who encouraged my curiosity, and I was the sort of child who liked to collect bugs and rocks and things like that. And also liked to be outdoors. And probably for me, I knew at an early age I was happiest when I was outside. And so for a long time, I thought that was actually a problem because most intellectual work is indoors and a lot of science is indoors. But I discovered geology. I discovered as a geologist, I could do intellectually exciting work, learn about the natural world, have the excitement of feeling like you actually understood some piece of it in a deep way, and be outside a lot of the time.
Matthias, you are a former politician and now a corporate representative. You're responsible for public affairs, science, and sustainability. So what's your personal link to science?
Yeah, my link started in middle school. I got inspired by a chemistry teacher. I also was able to spend a lot of time looking into chemistry, and my love for chemistry started there and never ended. I was not that long at university because I was elected quite young to become a member of parliament. So I never really worked in research, but I came to really treasure research when I was asked to help managing the mad cow disease crisis in Europe, and when a lot of the independent risk assessment that was conducted helped us to find a solution through data, through science, that solved that problem for the European people and also for the European food sector.
So for both of you, it started at a young age. Let's talk a little bit about trustworthiness of corporate science. So independence of research is an important attribute of scientific integrity. Naomi, in your opinion, can research-based companies ever make a credible contribution to science, or are their results by default somewhat biased because of conflicts of interest and, of course, the goal of profit making?
Well, I think the short answer to that question is both. So there is a long history of the corporate sector making important, valuable contributions to science, and particularly in Germany in the late 19th century, German private sector corporations were leaders in chemical research. Matthias, I'm sure, knows more about that probably than I do. And in the United States as well, we had fantastic corporate research laboratories at places like DuPont, General Electric, Westinghouse, Eastman Kodak, and these corporate research centers made important contributions to science, and in some cases, not just applied science, but even basic science. So Irving Langmuir at General Electric is a famous example. Langmuir won the Nobel Prize for work he did on thin films, which was crucial to the development of the improved lighting at General Electric. So we have seen a long and distinguished history in the corporate sector of good scientific research and a kind of productive integration of both basic and applied science. That said, so that's kind of the good news side of the story, but there's also a bad news story. The bad news side is that we've also seen the corporate sector being a force for disinformation. And I would say this history is not as deep, and that gives me hope that it doesn't have to continue this way. And I've written in my own work about the role of particular industries and particular corporations, particularly focused in certain sectors, the tobacco industry, the fossil fuel industry, but also some sectors of the chemical industry, especially associated with pesticides, lead paint, in which we have seen the corporate sector not only not be a leader in the role of science, but actually actively work to confuse the public about science. And this, of course, is deeply troubling for me. I hope it's deeply troubling for everyone listening here, because I do believe firmly that the private sector can be a force for good. I believe that history shows that in the past it often has been a force for good, but it can also be a force for bad. And I think it's that second part that motivates me to be here today to try to work with the private sector to ensure that Bayer and other corporations are a force for good and not a force for bad.
So let's get to that. Matthias, Bayer's purpose is science for a better life. What does Bayer do to enhance the trustworthiness of corporate science?
Yeah, first of all, we invest 5.5 billion euros every year in research and development. There are some 18,000 people working as scientists for Bayer, but there are also some 8,000 partnerships we have ongoing at any given moment with stakeholders that are not part of Bayer. And for me, it's really important to create transparency around those partnerships. What I noticed working for Bayer, but also working for other companies, that on both sides, the companies that give the money and on the receiving end, there is an uneasiness about transparency when it comes to funding. That, in my book, has to change, and we're going to introduce a transparency register. We start in Germany, where we spend the most of money, to really give the public full access to the degree of partnerships we have. Not that I believe that transparency solves everything, but without transparency, it's going to be very hard to solve this trust puzzle.
How do you judge this engagement, Naomi? Are there additional efforts or best practices in the industry that you're aware of? Could a partnership or a coalition be launched, perhaps including binding standards and controlled self-regulation?
Well, I was with you until the self-regulation part. I think we have a lot of evidence that self-regulation doesn't generally work very well. I mean, it's the old fox guarding the hen house thing. And we all know how hard it is to regulate ourselves, whether it's, overeating or smoking or drinking or whatever. So the idea that self-regulation alone could do the job, I think, would be overly optimistic. But that said, I do think that there are many things that can be done. I think this could be an area for research. I think that there hasn't been enough work to actually look closely at what kinds of corporate practices really work to change corporate cultures, because that's a big part of this, right? And I was very pleased to hear Matthias speaking about transparency. I think transparency is absolutely essential. If people don't know what's going on, then they have reason to be suspicious. In America, we say mold grows in dark places. I assume you have a comparable saying in German. So light, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So transparency is an absolutely necessary condition. But as Matthias says, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I think we need to have a deeper conversation, ideally with some rigorous research to look into, well, what other kinds of things really matter? Because one of the things that we do know from research is that corporations have cultures get into habits, and those habits are hard to break. And so, we see today that the tobacco industry, despite being prosecuted in the United States and elsewhere for its nefarious and at times even criminal activities, continues to spread disinformation, continues to try to addict children to its products. And why do they do this? Well, clearly something internal to the corporate culture of the tobacco industry has still fundamentally not changed. And we see the same thing in the fossil fuel sector, where even corporations that many people would view as, let's say, among the better or not the worst, continue to say things about climate change that, certainly in my view and the view of many scientists, are misleading. So how do we change that? One thing I've always wanted to do, and maybe this could be an area for a partnership if we could find the right people. Back in the 1990s, Lord Brown at British Petroleum tried to change the corporate culture at BP. It was very celebrated. There was a lot of talk about it, and it ultimately failed. And why did it fail? I don't know. I don't know if anyone's done a proper study of that. But I think there are cases like this where we could find examples where corporations have successfully changed the corporate culture, and cases where they haven't, and look at what were some of the differences. And clearly, this is not just a theoretical problem for Bayer, because as we all know, Bayer recently acquired Monsanto. Many observers do not think that the corporate practices at Monsanto were ones to be emulated. And so Bayer itself is going to have a challenge in terms of moving forward and regaining trust of many people based on some of the past activities of Monsanto.
Yeah, and I think that the topic of culture is really a crucial one, and we are looking very hard at what are the cultural elements, what are the historic drivers in our company that may be cause for problems. And Naomi, you can talk a lot about Monsanto, but when you are working for Bayer, you are better off looking even further in the past. And Bayer as a company in the history long before we were born also has done things that are, really for me hard to grasp or find words for. So that's why I avoid to kind of look at one part of the company, but rather try to establish a couple of principles. One principle is scientific engagement shouldn't be confused for lobbying. So a lot what you describe is the attempt to use scientific talking points for lobbying, sometimes to fund experts that make your public bidding, that come with the cloud of being scientists. And I think that's a practice that needs to stop. Another example is that you put regulators in a really difficult place when you share dossiers with them about data that underpins why your product should be approved, but you do not allow them to share that data with the broader public on grounds of competitive advantage or IP concerns. That's something we have changed. So when we apply a new pesticide or re-registration, we will be fully transparent with regard to our dossier, and our dossier will include adverse findings as well, which is another problem. If you only show to regulators the findings that make your case, you are not reflecting the complexity of science. Science is not a democracy. It's not who has the majority of studies. And I think it's really important for regulators to have the full body of evidence that leads to a company's bidding for approving or re-registering a product. And these are the changes we are starting. And there are, if you set the rules clear, they are quite easy to execute. But you have to be very clear on why you are doing that. The ultimate goal is that science, data, and facts are foundational for the approval of innovation and not a very intransparent and sometimes highly emotional conversation.
So perhaps one could also argue that the competition between industrial research and university research produces the best overall scientific results. Is the contribution of companies to science sometimes underestimated, Matthias?
Well, I think especially in the area of chemistry, we are in a very interesting moment where biology is meeting the possibilities of computing power, where we have gene editing, genomics in general, changing the world. We have seen that with the announcement the week started with BioNTech's quite promising announcement on the efficacy of the vaccine. So you have sometimes really strong corporate contributions, but you should never forget that most of the corporate contributions are grounded in a strong body of research that is done in universities and other non-business institutions. 8 out of the last 10 Nobel Prizes for chemistry went in the space of the biorevolution. And I think in none of the cases it was awarded to like a corporate scientist in that sense, but usually awarded to men and women who did more groundbreaking research in publicly funded institutions.
Naomi, do you think that the distrust among the public with regard to the credibility of corporate science generates negative spillover effects when it comes to the trust in science in general?
Well, this is a tricky question because it's not the same in all countries. We have very good data in the United States on this issue. I'm aware of some data in Europe, but I haven't looked at it as closely. But I do know that the way trust plays out in Germany, France, England, United States is not the same. And so it would be a mistake to overgeneralize. But I certainly think we have plenty of evidence here in the United States that the exposure of some of the malfeasance in the private sector has absolutely contributed to distrust, not just in the general public, but among scholars, researchers, and people like myself. So I was very happy to hear what Matthias just said about some of the steps Bayer's taking, and particularly this issue of transparency of data and not hiding behind this idea of proprietary data. Because this is something that we have seen extensively in the United States, that when citizens groups or even other academic researchers have asked for access to data on which regulatory decisions are being made, decisions that affect the health and safety of the American people, decisions that also affect the competitiveness of other companies, the regulators will tell citizens groups or researchers that they cannot see the data. And I don't see how any citizen can be expected to trust a regulation if they don't know what data it's based on. And I don't see how any academic could be expected to say this is a legitimate decision if we don't know what the data is. So I think making that data available is an absolutely huge, great step, and I'm really glad to hear that's being done. Making the adverse as well as the positive data available is essential, absolutely essential step. And I think it's hugely important that Bayer is doing that, because if Bayer does it, then it takes away the excuse. Other people, if they say, oh, but we can't do this because if we did, we wouldn't be competitive. Well, if Bayer can do it, then obviously these other corporations can do it too. So I think that's very, very important. And modeling that kind of transparency, I think, goes a long way towards the possibility of restoring trust, both in the company itself and in the regulatory agencies that are approving products based on company data.
So I have a question for both of you. What does trust in science mean for acceptance of future groundbreaking technologies? Take, for example, the Chemistry Nobel Prize for CRISPR. Innovation needs public acceptance, after all.
Well, if I could jump in on that, because I think that there's a very important distinction here that shouldn't be elided. So, in your question just now, you went very quickly from science to technology, but these are not the same things. And one of the things we do know about how the American people think about science is something that I think is completely legitimate, which is to say the data show, and there was a very good study done about this about a year or so ago by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And what they found is that by and large, the American people do still generally trust science, but they are sometimes concerned about the technologies that are being developed on the basis. And it's not because they don't trust the science. It's not because they distrust biologists or chemists. It's because they have legitimate ethical or social concerns about how those technologies will be used and whether or not they as citizens will have a voice in those decisions. And those are completely legitimate questions. And so it's extremely important for all of us who are involved in this issue, whatever the angle, not to align that and not to say that if a person has an ethical objection to some kind of technology, not to say that they're being, scientifically illiterate. And we have sometimes seen that happen. So whether it's vaccinations or genetically modified crops, I mean, one example I like to use because it's a hard example to dismiss, Pope Francis is opposed to genetic modification of organisms. Now, I'm not saying whether he's right or wrong to take that position. And, one could have a very principled conversation about what the basis of his concerns are, but it's not because he's an ignorant man. He is not an ignorant man. He's highly educated. He has outstanding scientific advisors in the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. In fact, they've just issued a major report. In fact, I have it right here on science and survival. This Pope is very sympathetic to science. He has been an important spokesperson in defending the science associated with climate change, but he is philosophically and theologically opposed to genetic modification of organisms. And that's a legitimate position for him to take, whether you agree or disagree with it. And it's not based on distrust in science. So if we're going to have a respectful conversation about this, we have to be able to acknowledge there are a set of issues here. There's science and whether we trust it and the people who are doing it. There's its applications. And then there are moral and ethical questions about technologies derived from science. These are all important, they're all legitimate, but they're not the same.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to kind of move away from science. Some of them are moral. Sometimes it's a more romantic worldview. Sometimes from the political right, it's this assumption that universities are kind of occupied by some left-leaning ideologues. From the political left, all the science is industry funded and therefore the results have to be bad. There is a conversation about that in society. And the problem is that some of those arguments are right, but if we follow that line of thinking in its totality, it's going to be really difficult to solve some of the biggest problems we are facing. So this year, we experienced that you can reduce carbon emissions by changing consumption habits. That's proven around the world, but it's done in a way that is not as much focused on innovation as it is on really stopping to consume certain things. And as a result, incomes are going down. So I'm a firm believer that if we want to solve some of the most pressing problems, we need innovations. Innovation comes from a stepwise process that translates science into products or solutions. And in order to do that, we need to protect intellectual property. But most importantly, we need independent regulators that assess whether those innovations have adverse effects or downsides that are not acceptable for society. This is a highly complex process, and ultimately strengthening the institutions that are necessary to get there is where we need to go as a society. The conversation is unfortunately one much more about feelings, about disagreements, and about undermining those very institutions.
Matthias,
I think that's exactly right. And I think the importance of a robust and independent regulatory structure, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because here in the United States, we find that many conservatives and many business people take a kind of reflexively anti-regulatory position. And I think the point they often miss is the one you just made, that a robust independent regulatory structure that is trusted by the citizenry of a country is actually in the interest of the private sector. It's in the interest of innovators, because if people trust the regulatory process, then they will trust the innovations and the products that come through that process. But if they think the process is corrupted, if they think there's regulatory capture, then they won't trust those products even when they're good. And we're seeing this now here in the United States with the potential COVID-19 vaccine. We have already a number of public opinion polls that have shown us that fully half of the American people, now it may have changed since last week's election result, but as of a couple of weeks ago, fully half of the American people said they would not take a vaccination for COVID-19, even if it was approved by the Food and Drug Administration. And that is a heartbreaking situation. It's not in the interest of the American people, it's not in the interest of public health, and it's not in the interest of Pfizer or whatever corporation develops a vaccine. So a robust, trusted, independent regulatory structure is absolutely essential for all parties. So really happy to hear you say that.
We have a comment coming in from our viewers. Natalie Mitchell says the problem is that money means more than the truth, and that's why disinformation prevails. We also have a comment from Tim Lambert. He says scientific illiteracy is a huge concern globally. How do we address this?
Well, on the first point, I think money is one of the factors that undermines trust in science. Technology is another. If you look at how certain opinions can be very cheaply as fake news transpiring around the systems, it's not always money. I think money and very complex and sophisticated lobby processes have been at the source of undermining science some 30, 40 years ago. Nowadays, it's much easier, which makes it much more dangerous in my book. So to the first part of the question, I'm not so sure whether it's always about the money alone. I think we also need to look at the ways information and disinformation are being spread around the world. That said, social media is not the culprit. It's just one factor we need to bear in mind.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In my book, Merchants of Doubt, which I co-authored with Eric Conway, and which is now 10 years old. We published that book in 2010. One of the things we showed in that book, what we really considered, what we learned through doing that research, was that it actually wasn't mostly about money. I mean, money clearly played a role. Money played a role in the propagation of disinformation, but the Merchants of Doubt were not primarily motivated by money. They were primarily motivated by ideology and by what George Soros has called market fundamentalism, this idea that we best solve all our problems through the market, and a kind of hostility to government and hostility to regulation. And so the force of ideology has been really, really powerful, particularly in the United States, but in some parts of Europe as well. I don't think it would be as powerful if it didn't also have money behind it. So it's not an either or story, but I think we make a mistake if we think that this is just about money. Similarly, with the question of scientific illiteracy, education, of course, is important. I'm an educator. I've dedicated my whole life to educating people about, either in science or about science. But again, we have a lot of evidence. We have scientific evidence from social science research that the rejection of science in key areas is not primarily caused by ignorance about that science. And that's a very sobering finding, because it means you can't solve the problem simply by educating people. You have to really dig deeper, and then you have to dig into the ideological, the ethical, the political elements. And that's hard for scientists to do, because in general, scientists don't like politics. We don't want our science to be politicized. And so we tend to shy away from those issues, even when those are actually the causal factors.
Now, I just want to mention, we have greetings at the moment and comments from all over the world, over 2,500 views from Guatemala, Costa Rica, Greece, the US, Netherlands, Algeria, Brazil, France, Venezuela, Mexico, South Africa, over 380 real comments. So a big thanks to all the viewers for tuning in here today. So let me talk to you now about how to increase the trust in science. It seems that there's an increasing lack of trust in science. So, for example, during this COVID-19 pandemic, we can observe an increasing amount of conspiracy theorists who entirely deny any scientific insights. Matthias, what do you believe is the cause for this denial?
I believe, and that goes back to looking at the US election, I believe that a lot of citizens in the United States were feeling that they were given really a very difficult choice, and that is to be either rich and sick or poor and healthy. So a very important thing in the midst of a pandemic is that people see that institutions work really, really well. Going back to a problem that back then I thought was like a really big one, it was very, very prevalent in Europe, mad cow disease. It was very difficult to talk about certain risks or to make certain suggestions as long as people had like deeply rooted fears. And it's very easy to talk about people who are concerned about certain policies and to belittle them as not understanding the facts when in reality they feel threatened in their very existence. So if we want to build trust in science, we got to have better choices than rich and sick or poor and healthy. That's the number one precondition for getting this right.
Naomi, you wrote the book, Why Trust Science? What are your key arguments and how can we counteract the distrust in science?
Well, the key argument of the book is that many people have a misunderstanding of how science operates. So many people think that if we trust science, or if we should trust science, it's because scientists use the scientific method. Or they think that we should trust science because scientists are geniuses. Both of those views are misconceptions, misapprehensions of how science actually operates. So in the first part of the book, I talk about this question of scientific method, and I show that there isn't one scientific method, that scientists do a variety of different things, that the methodologies of, let's say, clinical trials are quite different than the methodologies, say, of climate modeling, which are quite different than the methodologies of botany. And that understanding this is important because one of the strategies that people promoting disinformation will use sometimes is to say, oh, well, scientists didn't, these climate modelers, and we've seen this especially in climate modeling, these climate modelers are not doing experiments, so therefore it's not scientific, it's not the scientific method, and we don't have to believe it. Or they'll say it's just a model. Well, modeling is a very important method in contemporary science. So explaining to people that there's a diversity of models, that science is a kind of toolkit, and just as a carpenter would never go to a project with only a hammer, the carpenter would have a whole set of tools in the toolkit, so scientists have a whole set of tools. And understanding that the tools are diverse and that scientists choose the tools that are most appropriate for the question at hand is a very important thing for the public to understand. The other second major argument of the book is that science is not primarily the result of geniuses. There may be geniuses in science, and if there are, that's great, and we welcome their work. But what makes science trustworthy is not that an individual is a genius, but that the scientific community as a whole vets the claims. That is to say, whoever comes up with the idea, whether it's a genius or an ordinary rank and file scientist, the claims have to be vetted by fellow scientists. The scientists have to present the data. Again, this is where transparency comes in. The data have to be subject to peer review and vetting and discussion. And then, even once a paper gets published, important scientific knowledge is never based on just a single paper. It's based on a body of knowledge that begins to develop over time. And so if we have a subject like climate change or the safety of vaccinations, where we have a robust body of data, lots and lots of scientific papers, maybe we have some meta-analyses, many different people have worked on it, and they've looked at the problem from many different angles, then we have good reason to believe that the results are likely to be robust. And that is really the basis of trust in science, the social processes of criticizing and vetting claims so that the claims that finally emerge are the ones who have stood up in the face of tough scrutiny.
Perhaps linked to this, we have a comment from one of our viewers in Canada who writes, as a science graduate student, I've noticed that the general public opposes ideas that are being forced upon them, such as vaccines, but it's fine if it's optional, like Neuralink technology, even if the outcomes promote the greater good. So what do you think is the best approach to convince people to be more pro-science without confusing them with the hard data and the science jargon involved?
Yeah, one of the things is I think we need to generally embrace innovation. We need to understand that, yes, we fight quite a few big challenges, be it global warming, be it an increasing number of people who are food insecure, be it an increasing number of people who don't have access to water or to health. But through innovation, we can solve quite a few problems. If you think about the world population doubled in my lifetime, we have more people running around today than ever before. Let's make sure we use our capability for the good of the planet and therefore also for our own and our children's good. So there needs to be a certain level of positive expectation that innovation can sort stuff out. And again, one important source of innovation is science, sometimes groundbreaking science. The more we talk about what's possible, the better. The other thing is, I believe in the power of the positive stories. Yeah, so it's not one man and his wife, but a couple in Mainz that came up with the first vaccine that has a real shot on helping us to resolve the COVID crisis. It's two women who will be awarded the Chemistry Nobel Prize for gene editing. Let's tell the stories of the people who are doing that. Not in the sense of that they are geniuses, because they are human beings, and there's good, bad, and all the other things as well. But the interesting thing here is that those stories about those people are usually very engaging. So rather than kind of talking about, you don't understand it, the facts are clear, let's embrace the people that are actually doing the work much more and tell the stories behind it, because it's about an emotional thing. The resistance against science is like almost always an emotional reaction to something rather than a really carefully weighted rational argument. Some people are really rational in leveraging emotions against science, but that doesn't change what I just said.
Naomi, what do you think is the best approach to convince people to be more pro-science without confusing them?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. It's not my job to convince people to be pro-science or anti-science. I think that when people understand science, they're in a better position to judge scientific claims and also to judge the technologies that are associated with those. So it's about empowering people to make intelligent judgments. I think most people can do that. I don't think that science is often as complicated as people make it out to be. I think sometimes scientists actually exaggerate the complexity because it makes them feel important, but that almost all science can be explained to a reasonably educated public. I sometimes think we exaggerate how complicated this is. The only thing I would add, and again, I agree with essentially everything Matthias is saying. The only thing I would add is that I think that innovation alone, and I'm thinking you probably agree with this too, based on what you said about regulatory structures, innovation alone is not enough. It's, again, a necessary but not sufficient condition. So I totally support the idea that a company like Bayer can play a really positive role in society through creative innovation and the production of products that can help make our lives better and help feed people or cure disease. But I think history also clearly shows that technology by itself doesn't do the job, almost never does the job. And I think, Matthias, you mentioned population, and that's one of the clearest examples we have. So I teach the history of hormonal contraception. I've done a little bit of research about it. Mostly I just, rely on other researchers. But one of the things we know very clearly is that many of the people who worked on hormonal contraception have had very great aspirations to help solve the world population problem. And it didn't work. As you've just said, population continues to grow, even though we have innovative products that were invented by scientists and promoted by excellent companies, excellent pharmaceutical companies like Syntex, made available, made affordable. We had this innovation, and yet it turned out lots and lots of women didn't use it. And why was that? Well, one of the things we know, it's complicated, it's not just one thing, but one of the things we know is that population growth is directly correlated with women's education. When women are educated and have other opportunities besides simply motherhood, almost all women will choose to have fewer children. And then they will choose to use birth control methods that are available to them. But when they're not educated, when there's no other option, and when they need children to help tend the fields or to take care of them in their old age, then they will have more children. And so then that points also to the social structures. Without social security, people need children. They need a lot of children. And again, it points to the role of disease. If children die in infancy, then women will have more pregnancies in order to ensure that some of these children make it to adulthood. So it turns out there's a whole nexus of social, social, regulatory, and educational factors. And when you bring them all to bear, then the innovation is used and the innovation has the effect you want. But if you just have the technology by itself, if you just hand women contraceptive pills, you don't get population control.
I mean, we are very active in this space, in part because we believe that giving women access to family planning and ensuring that girls have a choice whether they want to have children or not is almost a precondition for us solving the other laudable goals in the global goals on sustainable development. And I think we all started this year hoping that we now accelerate progress against achieving the SDGs. And soon after, we woke up in a very different world. So let's see whether 2021 will be a different year. I'm quite optimistic, in part because topics like climate have not been pushed away by the concern that was, of course, fueled by the pandemic. So generally speaking, we need to double down also in family planning. For me, one factor is that those women who want to have access to family planning should get it. Like we generally need to improve access to health. But I also agree with you that this is not the solution. The solution is not technology. The solution to helping smallholder farmers is not just technology. It's not just better seeds or fertilizers or crop protection. Looking at half of the smallholder farmers in the world, almost half being women, how they are able to take care of their children is sometimes even more a factor in determining their success than all the great agronomic tools that we talk about. And for business, it's very important to understand that complexity as they move in the direction of increasing access to health or other areas like that. So when Bayer said we want to do health for all, hunger for none, the two important words are all and none. And if you want to really improve access and if you want to drive inclusive growth, you got to move away from your love for features, and you have to look at the bigger picture. Speaking of, we can debate whether agriculture is 20% or 27 or 33% responsible for the loss of biodiversity. It just doesn't matter. It's just such a large number that action is needed. And one of the mistakes in scientific affairs of the crop protection industry for many, many years was debating the exact number of responsibility rather than driving action where it's possible and providing evidence that action really helps, either to solve land use change or to solve for protecting insects and all the other things you need to do in order to do something against the biodiversity loss that is probably an even bigger problem than we care to realize. So for me, business has a very difficult thing to do, and that is to accept scientific facts when they're really inconvenient for their business model, and to do something about the business model rather than to tinker around with the scientific facts.
So follow the science has become an international catchphrase, especially among the Fridays for Future movement. And at the same time, different studies find different results. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, scientific advice changed several times. So is there really the one science that can be followed?
Well, no, there isn't the one science. I mean, we use science as a general term to describe a lot of different activities. And clearly immunology is not the same as virology, which is not the same as public health, which is not the same as primary care to patients. And so one of the reasons why a pandemic is complicated and hard to get your hands around is because there are a lot of different factors that play in. And again, this is another example of what we've just been talking about. The private sector could produce a great vaccine, could produce a vaccine that's 95% effective with very few side effects and very few allergic reactions. But if people don't trust the vaccine and won't take it, then the greatest innovation in the world won't have the effect we want. So in fact, when we think hard about it, we realize that the science of vaccines has to include psychology and sociology. And these are things that in my experience are often discounted by natural scientists. So part of the challenge here is to get all the different pieces together in a space of mutual respect. And that's something that we often haven't had in the past. I just want to make one other small comment, because Matthias was talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, and we were told by our producer not to mess with our camera, but I have to because I'm wearing my millennial pin here.
So I noticed.
So I think this is a nice example of why I think many of us agree on the goals. There really isn't a question about the goals. I think I can't imagine anyone who doesn't agree that we should try to eradicate hunger and try to have good health for all. The question is how we get there. And that, in my experience, involves rejecting the dichotomies of science, versus society, or, I think what Matthias said a couple of moments ago was really important about the pandemic here in the United States, that people thought the choice was to be rich and sick or poor and healthy. And it's true that if you're offered that choice, well, that's a Faustian bargain. I mean, neither of those choices is good, right? But it's also a false dichotomy because it isn't true. And we have seen, particularly again here in the United States, but in Europe too, for decades, some elements of the private sector pushing the narrative that economic growth requires us to compromise environmental protection or requires us to compromise public health. And that is a false dichotomy. And we have many, many examples that prove that it's a false dichotomy. But the pandemic, particularly what has happened in the United States, is the clearest proof we could ever, well, I don't want to say hope for, the clearest proof we could ever have dreaded, because what we have in the United States now is that we are poor and sick, that by not attending to public health, by not trusting science, we made the pandemic massively worse than it needed to be. I mean, you all, if you're in Germany, you know that death rates in the United States are massively higher than they are in Germany and much higher still than they are in South Korea. We've made a mess of the public health and we've damaged our economy hugely as well. So the idea that we could somehow protect the economy while letting people get sick was completely fallacious. And I'm hoping that if there's any silver lining to this pandemic, is that people will begin to point this out and the American people will begin to realize that the economy isn't something out there separate from us. The economy is us. And if we're not healthy and we can't work, then the economy will suffer.
I want to turn once more to a comment that came in from one of our viewers who says, can people cope with science today in the times of Instagram at all? Today, people expect clear yes or no statements, whereas science can only say unless proven otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, people always wanted certainty and were very confused with ambiguity. Yeah? So some people are really good dealing with ambiguity. Other people, when they see ambiguity, they just want to kill that little word. Yeah. So that's not driven by social media per se. If you look into the history, you always have debates where anything that's not clear cut suddenly also is easily attacked. Where I think the problem is that what is a sufficient scientific consensus? Yeah, you can always have like a minority view on something, but you have a broad body of science that supports something. And there is a whole, I hate this word in the context of not ecosystems, but there is a whole ecosystem that you need of institutions, of also self-regulation of scientists, of transparency and all of that, that gets you to something that is reasonably solid. So for example, for me, it's reasonably solid that we have a problem with climate change. And it's also reasonably solid that humans play a big part in that. How big exactly the problem is, I don't know. What I know is that even optimistic scenarios tell the government of India that in their 75th anniversary since independence, they are running deeper and deeper into a water crisis. That's good enough for me to do something. I don't need to know the exact scenarios. I just need to be directionally certain. And I think directional certainty is really important. And unfortunately, that is undermined. Sometimes it's the society complaining about it, sometimes also business. One of the reasons why I love good regulation is my disdain for some of the ways science is being dragged into courtrooms in the United States, where again, it's not about the full body of evidence, it's about making a very good case that supports your case that can skew a decision about a product in one or the other direction. If I have to choose between strong regulators that give me certainty and weak regulators that put me in front of courtrooms in the United States, I always go for the former.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think the idea that the public demand absolute certainty is a myth, I don't think that's true. I don't think we have any good scientific evidence to support that. In fact, I think everyday experience tells us it's not true. I mean, we all make decisions every day. We accept a job or turn down a job or decide where to go to the university or get married. I mean, we make major decisions all the time in the face of all kinds of uncertainties, and it doesn't paralyze us. You know, we make choices, we accept a job or we turn it down, we save for a vacation or retirement. I think the idea that uncertainty is somehow paralyzing has no scientific support whatsoever. But I think what Matthias just said is correct. We have seen the deliberate exploitation of scientific uncertainty by particularly certain elements of the private sector who have tried to say we can't act on climate change and we can't act on vaccine safety because because there are these little questions. And of course, there will always be questions in science. Science is a process of learning and discovery. And so by definition, if we're continuing to learn, then there will always be things that we're not quite sure about. And we should do that as a good thing, since that kind of uncertainty drives discovery, drives innovation. It shouldn't be something that we're ashamed of. And scientists should not, in my opinion, spend a lot of time saying, oh my God, but somebody asked this question. I mean, one thing we've seen in the climate realm is that the fossil fuel industry will say, well, what about this little detail? And the scientific community will say, oh my gosh, we have to answer that detail. I call this the third decimal place problem. And so scientists will go to work desperately trying to sort out this detail, and they'll get it sorted out. And then the fossil fuel industry will, oh, well, what about this detail? And it's a kind of game of fetch. And I consider it to be a sort of trick that scientists get fooled into thinking that if only they would answer these uncertainties, then somehow the industry would say, okay, you're right. Whereas the reality is what Matthias just said. We have an enormous body of evidence. On the question of human causes, I think it's more than reasonably certain. I think it's like certain beyond any possible reasonable doubt, and I'd be happy to sit down but it doesn't matter. His point is the right one. It doesn't matter. It's certain enough, and it's certain enough to know that we should be acting on it. And also it's certain enough to know that if we don't act, it gets much worse and it gets much harder and much more expensive to solve. So delay is not in our interest. And that's the other key point that fits with this model of knowing the direction of change. We know the direction and we have a pretty good idea of the magnitude, even if it's not exact, but we also know that delay is costly. And that's a key part of the message that needs to be communicated.
We have less than 10 minutes, so let's end by talking about the outlook and boundaries of science. The whole discipline of economics was, for instance, heavily criticized for not having predicted the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And now, while there's strong scientific consensus on the causes and effect of climate change, which you just mentioned, Matthias, we still lack technological solutions to solve this problem. So are there boundaries on what science can actually achieve?
One of the books I really love is a book called Super Forecasting. And it really helps you when you also see, for example, the criticism of the profession of pollsters, to just think about sometimes when we try to determine the future, what really the process is. And I feel like, first of all, we should not hold it against science when something that was true suddenly is no longer true. So our chief medical officer, Mike DeVoy, is one of the happiest persons when a clinical trial produces a reasonably clear result, even though the result is not what he wanted. We had this conversation when it was about a certain malaria drug that got some popularity in the United States and later globally. He was super happy with more clarity. And I think that's really important. An expert who is able to change his opinion, I prefer always over the person that just can't live with having been wrong. When I joined the German government in the midst of mad cow disease, there were tons of experts who believed that a European cow can't get mad. In hindsight, that was a completely wrong belief. But the important point is when something changes, to have the agility to change your behaviors and not to spend all your energy in doubting that the science behind why something should change is right or wrong. So I believe that we really need to focus on celebrating both progress and clear stop signs that are a result of a scientific process.
Naomi, do you think that science can win back lost trust in the upcoming years?
Well, I think we actually can, but I want to answer the other question before we get to that, because I think it's a really important one. So first of all, I think it's important to say that anything involving people is going to be hard to predict, right? I mean, we know that people are extremely varied. They're much more varied than electrons. And we know that people change in response to changing circumstances. So in that sense, they're also extremely different than electrons. And we also know that there is no average man, right? The statistical notion of an average man is not a very helpful one for understanding why people do the things that they do. So it's not surprising that prediction in any area that involves people, whether it's economics, psychology, sociology, is going to be very, very hard. Sometimes people use the phrase hard science to refer to physics. I think the really hard sciences are the sciences of people. So I don't think it's an indictment of those sciences that they take on tough questions, but I think we have to recognize that these questions are extremely hard. But I'm influenced by the American pragmatists, the philosophers who lived around the start of the 20th century, people like William James, C.S. Peirce, John Dewey. And American pragmatism has sometimes been summed up as the philosophy of living with uncertainty and learning from mistakes. And I think that's just a great way to think about this problem, because we do live with uncertainty. No amount of science will ever eliminate uncertainty altogether, but we can live with that uncertainty and we can still make decisions, and we can also learn from our mistakes. American pragmatism was founded on the notion that part of the reason science was successful and why we should trust it was because scientists were good at acknowledging what was working in their theories and what wasn't, and then learning from the mistakes or the parts that didn't work and making the theories better. And I think if we have a picture of science like that, of people who are flexible, who are open to new information, that's a much more appealing view, actually, than a bunch of dogmatic people telling you what to think. And so I think that we absolutely can, and now I can answer your second question, we can absolutely regain trust in science, because actually among most people, we haven't actually lost it. Most Americans still, despite all of the noise and the chatter, still do believe that our lives are broadly better because of science and technology. Americans are very sympathetic to innovation. Most Americans consider innovation to be a really good word. And so we have a foundation for trust in science, technology, and innovation, but we need to do more to reach out to people to address the areas of concern, and where there's disinformation, to explain that it is in fact disinformation, because we also have evidence that that works. And where there's fear, if we have a legitimate basis to address those fears, then to do that in an empathetic way. And then finally, where there are ethical concerns, not to dismiss ethical concerns as ignorance or fear, but to say, well, let's sit down and talk about them and see if there's a way that we can resolve this problem that is ethically acceptable.
Those are great insights. Thank you so much. I'm happy to say that we have viewers tuned in to this from all continents. Over 400 likes and reactions already, over 500 comments already, some great questions from our viewers, and over 4,000 video views. So on that note, I would like to thank you very much, both of you, Naomi, Matthias, for all those fantastic insights and comments. We've all learned a lot. And on that note, I'd like to end our event on trust in science. And to our viewers, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great discussion.